I grew up in Hallsville, Texas, Far East Texas, about 45 minutes from Shreveport, Louisiana. Oh, my childhood was awesome. Growing up in a small town with family all around, it can make it awesome. I grew up with my aunt on the right side of me, my uncle, well, my grandmother to, well, let me take that back. My grandmother to the right side, my aunt to the left, and then I had a series of uncles that were on the right side of my grandmother. So I grew up with a lot of family nearby, and it was an interesting childhood to say the least, because I didn't have any cousins that lived near me that were my age, so I tended to be everyone's, I wouldn't say everyone's baby, but I had a way of popping over to everyone's house throughout the day in the summertime, and yet feeling my grandmother right there next to me all the time. That was wonderful. She told me stories about her childhood in Hallsville, and she would show us clothes. She ended up having Alzheimer's later in her life, but before she completely lost her memory, she would tell us stories about places that she would go and fish, and areas that she would play, and stories about her school and her childhood friends. And so we would drive throughout the community and look at places where she had spent her childhood. And she was always informative about how she and her cousins interacted, and how she and her grandmother, or how her great grandmother looked. She loved life, and she loved the area that she grew up in. It was the Mount Pleasant community in Hallsville, and she loved every minute of it. And so I think memories of her telling those stories, as well as interacting with people she grew up with, they all lived in the same area. So we would walk to Uncle Lamb's house and visit Cousin Alberta, and just do different things like that, pick blackberries, and get chickens out of the chicken coop for dinner that night. Things like that are my most fondest memories with my grandmother. I think that's what gave me this love and passion for history. The fact that my grandmother gave us such good foundations in the past. Even though she talked about enslavement, as far as her great-grandmother was the one person she knew to be enslaved, she always gave you positive memories of people. So she would tell you about how her grandmother looked and how she cooked. She would tell you how her great-grandmother looked and how she made her feel. She always gave this positive atmosphere that even though we are African American and we're the minority, we always felt value in who we were. And she did it for every grandkid, is what's amazing, because we all complain, that I was her favorite. No, I was her favorite. And really, really, we can't judge or disseminate who was the actual favorite, because she made us all feel that special. And I remember I saw Roots for the first time when I was 11, and I was captivated by the idea of this man finding all the way back to the motherland, his ancestry. And so I was on a mission. I had this green book, and I put paper in it, and I was going to make a family tree. And I went to my grandmother, and she didn't tell me, I don't have time for you today, come back on a different day. She sat there and explained to me every child of every sibling of her mother's. Then she went through and she talked to me about her mother's mother, and how she arrived, or how she lived in Texas. And she told me about her grandfather, who they called Pap, and how he was such a good man, and about his family. And she gave me all these wonderful stories. And so I held on to those stories for many years, until I was mature enough to understand that, hey, I probably need to look for evidence for some of these family stories that we have. And I started doing that in 2008, just looking for evidence of certain things. And I started looking, of course, through the census records, and just digging through death certificates. And that's one thing I treasure here at the Carver Museum, because it gave me a way of finding out, how do other people find information. And so she gave me the hook that drew me into history, and I love her for that. Absolutely love her for it. One thing I remember doing, I was a TV kid, and enjoying TV, I didn't realize that I was looking for shows that showed historical implications. Like Little House on the Prairie was my favorite show. I didn't realize why Little House on the Prairie was my favorite show until I started journaling, and I realized that what I really liked about it was this family uh, dynamic between Laura Ingalls and her father or her mother, and the fact that she was telling her story, her history, and giving you a glimpse as to how that looked in this small town of Walnut Grove, you know. And I love that show. And it could have been the fact that we didn't have cable, you know, we had basic TV, so it was the only thing showing. But I just remember sitting there watching it, and I would ask my grandmother questions, and she would feel free to answer questions for me. Yeah, we had a well, or yes, you know, we slept outdoors. You know, they had a porch. And she said that there were times that they were able to sleep out on the porch, and that her parents did. When they had company or they had someone living in their household, they slept out on the porch, which just sounds absolutely amazing to me now, because we wouldn't dare do that in today's time. But just different things like that were appealing to me. And I always felt like Laura Ingalls was in some way a version of my grandmother, going back and forth doing different things, even though it was many, many years before she was a child. When I was in 6th grade, I was determined that I was going to be a professor of African American Studies, and it was just that title, a professor of African American Studies in 6th grade. I used to read books and biographies about Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, and every Black History Month at church, I was the person who wanted to be involved and give my stand on what I felt. When I finally reached my senior year of school, I felt like, well, you know, to be a professor of African American Studies is going to take a long time. You may not want to do that just yet. So I decided that I wanted to be a museum curator. And I sought out going to Baylor College, and I had my parents go to the big day, the college day, to see how the school was going to operate. And of course, my dad was looking at fiscal responsibilities. And when he walked out of that session about the fiscal responsibilities of Baylor, he was just like, no, we're not going to be able to send you to Baylor. If you were going to be a doctor or a lawyer, we can see that. But, you know, museum science, it just didn't appeal to them. And I understood, because it was a lot of money. And my parents, you know, they did well for themselves, but of course they could not send their daughter to a private college. And so I ended up going to Kilgore College for 2 years. Enjoyed every minute of it, transferred to UT Tyler. And when I got to UT Tyler, I was still dating my high school sweetheart, and I had my daughter, my oldest daughter, Kennedy. And so when I had her, my dad said, you need an insurance policy. So, you know, these dreams of being a curator or museum science, you know, I know that they're your dreams, but you need an insurance policy. So you need to think about, what are you going to do following college? And so my mom was a teacher. And so I said, I'll teach, you know, it'll just be a couple of years. I'm not going to teach that long. And so I went into teaching, got my certification in social studies, where I could teach 8 through 12. And when I did that, I ended up teaching high school in Longview, at Longview High School, teaching 11th grade U.S. history. And I loved my content, loved every minute of it. And so I taught content when I taught 11th grade, and I attempted to get students interested in social studies by giving them different stories and telling them what was the status quo that the state wanted them to know, but yet here's some more information for you to grapple about. And I loved inspiring them through history. And so then I moved with my husband at the time and went to Bryan, and I worked there, and I worked at Conroe High School as well, a school called Caney Creek High School in Conroe. And I loved my content still. I taught different subjects, geography, economics, and various courses. But then I moved back to Longview following my separation. And when I moved back to Longview, I ended up getting a job at Judson Middle School. And that changed my teaching career, because at that point, I was no longer teaching a content, I was teaching students. Because 8th graders, I don't care how much inspiration you try to give them, they don't care. And they don't care about early American history. And I realized too that I wasn't teaching about famous individuals per se, I was teaching more about legacies. And one of the legacies I had to teach was slavery. And that became a complicated topic in my class, given the fact that I was supposed to teach students not only about the struggles of enslavement, but also teaching them the cause of the Civil War, which has caused much contention this past summer. And so I realized that at that point I was teaching students and not content, and I needed to be very delicate on how I gave content to students, because just showing them images and giving them a story was not enough, and at times it was too much for them to swallow, because they didn't understand the implications behind it, and they didn't necessarily have conversations at home that dealt with historical topics. So at that point, I felt as if I needed to do more to help students, and I went and got my master's in education administration. And at that point, I was stuck in education. Yeah, so, and since Judson, I taught at Longview High School for a couple of more years after I left Judson. And then that's when I arrived in Austin. And I came to Round Rock for an interview as an instructional coach. I had finished my master's and I was looking for a leadership opportunity, but I wasn't quite ready to be a principal or an assistant principal. I wanted to really stay in my content area because I recognized that there's still a need to teach social studies and history, and in a fashion that can not only generate interest for students, but also be sensitive to the understanding of what kids go through every day. So I came to Round Rock for an interview, was offered the job as an instructional coach for the district, and I loved it. I got to see some spectacular teachers in Round Rock, and I felt as if Round Rock was going to be my final destination as far as teaching. And I went to the National Council for Social Studies, met up with a lot of different people, and happened to run into the Region 13 social studies specialist, and she was telling me about an opportunity to work for Region 13, and I thought, that's wonderful. You know, I think that would be great for anyone. And she made the statement, well, no, I think that you ought to apply. And I still didn't think anything of it because I had only been working in Round Rock for two and a half years. And I thought, I just don't know about that. What is a social studies specialist really going to do to impact students? Because I felt as an instructional coach, I was impacting teachers, which in hand impacted students. And so I communicated with a lot of people about it, and they said, well, no, you really ought to do it. We think you would be a great fit. And I started to pray about it and think about it more. And, you know, I felt in my spirit that I should go ahead and apply. So I did, and I got the job. And I think now it's a matter of taking my ideas of getting student interest and building content for students to disseminate and to find evidence for, that all of that comes back into play when it comes to social studies instruction, but giving it on a larger scale. How can we give students information and not give them just the facts? Really give them a meaning to why they're studying, you know, any era of history, whether it's westward expansion or the Civil War or World War II. I think that kids are preconditioned now in classrooms to just listen and not really explore and dive into artifacts and records. And so that's my goal now, is to give teachers more of a historian or a genealogy perspective to education. Give students records, give them just a tidbit of information, and then let them explore and come out with conclusions that they may find. And yet create your room into possible opportunities for exhibits. Give students the curator's lens to what information needs to be shared with others. I have a lot of ideas on how to make that happen, and I'm still in the early stages of my my new position. But that's my goal, is to get many more students thinking about history outside of the classroom and asking those questions to their grandmother or to their parents about what it is to be who they are or to be American. I would give Black parents the advice to seek out a community. I think a lot of that has to do with people moving away or schools moving away from community building. I can remember even when I was in school going to a small town, it was not unusual for my grandmother to know what happened at school before my parents knew what was happening at school. So it was almost like you got a triple punishment. You got a punishment at school, a punishment for your grandmother, and then a punishment from each of your parents. So I think that's what's missing in school systems currently, is that community building where you're not only talking to the parent on more than one level. You're talking to them as not only an administrator or a teacher, but you're also talking to them as a community member and a person who's an advocate for their child. So if I had to give parents advice, it would be to find your community. And it doesn't mean that your community or your village has to be people who look like you. It could be that you're going to find one teacher in that campus who can speak to your child in case there's an issue, or be an advocate for your child in case you can't make it. Have your place of worship involved in knowing what your student is doing. You know, give the pastor an invitation to their graduation, or contact the person who leads your Bible study and let them know to pray for your child when it comes to things that you're concerned about. So that's the biggest advice I would give to a parent. Being a single parent myself, is to create a village, create a community for your child where you know that even if you can't communicate to them, there's someone else who can. You know, when I first moved to Austin, it was mostly, I loved the atmosphere. I loved the music. I loved the free spirit of the city. Unlike Dallas and Houston that seemed to be overwhelming to me as far as the behavior of the people, as well as the traffic and different things within those cities. I found Austin to be a very laid back atmosphere, and everyone was friendly and everyone sought to do the right thing, in Round Rock especially. I have seen a difference as far as it appears. I remember when I first moved here, I was searching for a black community. And that's why I always ended up here at the Carver Museum, because I felt like, oh, well, you know, this is the Carver Museum and it's in the center of the African American Cultural District. And I should be able to find things for my kids to do and friends for myself and my kids, because I wasn't finding a lot of African American friends outside of the school system. And so I would come here and I would do different things. And one thing that I started to see, having come to this location, was that there is an agency within Austin to keep black communities relevant. And whether it stems from the Carver Museum or it comes from organizations such as Sisters Trying or Black Girls Run, or there's agency for the people who live here to be committed to things. And so I can say wholeheartedly that maybe I'm seeking out these people, but it appears as if Austin, even though we have a small population of African Americans, that those who are here are thriving, and they're seeking to create a culture that is understood and that is not going to be forgotten. And that's the one thing that makes me excited to live here, because even though we're few in number, we are seeking change in the area. And so that excites me. And I remember that there was a big, PBS had a forum. And I remember sitting there, and I had heard of gentrification, and I could definitely see the gentrification happening in the area simply because I go to church at St. James over off Martin Luther King. And you would drive and you would see all of these wonderful housing developments, and then you would drive around the corner and you would see an area that was impoverished. And I was like, how does that work? How does that happen? And being at St. James, we were actually going to visit different people in the community, and we went to this one man's house, and he was over the age of 90, I'm sure, and he talked about how he and others have been asking for sidewalks to be placed in their community. And instead of placing sidewalks, they place bicycle lanes. And he said, how does that happen? People need sidewalks to walk on. There are people who do not own a car, so they walk to the bus stop, and some of them don't have a sidewalk to walk on within their neighborhood. They have to wait until they get on Martin Luther King. So things like that made me aware of how gentrification is affecting other people who didn't ask for it. And whereas I understand that for some major cities, it's a great thing, it's building up wonderful revenue, there are a lot of people here in the city who are suffering because of it and not getting the attention that they need, simply because there are others who are able to give more funds towards the city, and it's just unfortunate. I remember having a conversation with my mom. We were driving by Wiley College in Marshall, Texas, and she was telling me how on, I can't remember the name of the street, but the street that is adjacent to the main buildings of Wiley College, I think it's on, I want to say it's University, but I could be completely wrong. But she told me how this community had both middle class and upper class African Americans, how the doctor would be living next to the teacher, who would be living next to the barber, who would be living next to the custodian of the school. And that sounds beautiful to me, you know, just to know that as a kid you can walk out and see different professions and how they live and upkeep their house. And I think that that piece of community left when integration came in, because we were all seeking social justice and we were all seeking to have equitable housing and equitable school resources. And that was wonderful to seek it out, because we did deserve it, we did need it. However, it happened so fast that it didn't give the community an opportunity to transition to things like that. And so now, where we see an integration of races, we still see a segregation of economic wealth. And it's complicated, because you want to be in an area that's safe and sound, and you want to be in an area yet that's culturally diverse, but yet you have to make decisions that are best for your financial future. And so it concerns me that the way we're moving as a country, that the more people are making decisions based on their financial being, that they're forgetting about the community that they came from. And so one thing that I hold dear to Hallsville is that we are a community of various groups, but on Mount Pleasant Road, where Lucille grew up, you will see a variation of people. All different types, different ages, different economic backgrounds, and it's all centered around this idea of a love of community and land. And so you might see one house that looks completely different from the other, but you know that that's Cousin Colby across the street, or that's Miss Ida Mae down the road, or that's Uncle Lamb that lives above the hill. You know, it's that certainty that the community will not be forgotten. You don't see that in the city per se, but I know it's there, because people talk about it and they come back to their churches and they come back to areas that remind them of home. But I do question whether or not are we going to break that surface and fight to remain in our communities that actually need us there in order to keep it thriving. I think that we have been fighting for so long to be considered equals in a country that was not designed for us to be equals, that did not originate with the idea of us being equals, that we do assimilate almost out of necessity. Assimilation is not bad. It's when you assimilate and you don't go back. So I love the emblem that sits here in the Carver Museum, the Sankofa, to go back and fetch. And there was a lady, I can't think of her name, I heard her on radio, but she said it's not just to go back and fetch, but it's to relive and remember. And that's what we have to do as African Americans. We can say that we don't want to talk about enslavement, that we don't want to necessarily talk about segregation and all of the past that happened before us. But in order for us to truly understand who we are and truly give our kids value of who they are, you have to relive. And the way you relive is you tell your story. You ask people their stories. you give your children opportunities to see historical markers and understand what's happening. You revisit cemeteries and continue to create opportunities for beautification of that cemetery so that memories and people are not lost. There's worth in going back and finding out where you came from. I really do believe that we live patterns of life. And the more we go back into our pattern, the more we're able to understand. And so assimilation is not a bad thing, but when you assimilate and forget, it can be. When I think of forced integration, it does make me sad because I do see a disconnect between those children who went their whole school career totally in a segregated environment, not feeling at all concerned about who they were as a person or what things they could do, to also looking at those group of students who were forced integrated, whether they were in grade school or high school. There is a disconnect. And I do feel as if they suffer from some type of post-traumatic stress. Can you imagine going into an environment as a kid and either being yelled at or knowing that bombs were placed under buses or knowing that the principal didn't necessarily want you there or the teacher didn't treat you the same? I do feel like it happened too hasty. I think that it was not a equitable integration because you did not see kids of color staying in their campuses and seeing other kids of Anglo heritage coming into their school. It was always the opposite way. So hindsight, should we have done it differently? I definitely think we could have done it differently. However, if it had not happened, we would have still been so many steps back if we wouldn't have received equitable resources. So it's kind of, you just have to, sometimes things happen without necessarily a thought as to how it's going to happen, but it must happen. But do I think that those students suffer from some type of trauma? Yes. Yes, and I think that it followed up with their children and their children's children. I think that there is a legacy of wanting to please others or not wanting to please others within our own community as African Americans that lends itself to us having to make conscious decisions about what we're willing to do and not willing to do in a public place, what jobs we're willing to take and not willing to take. Based upon our level of education and our experience, because we recognize that we might be looked upon differently. Now, for my own children, it's complicated because I see them dealing with their own understanding of their friends and their own understanding of the people that they're around, and when things are done differently and they don't immediately come to race as the conclusion, but you can tell innately that they know it's something about me being different. And it's hard to offer that conversation to them when you know that the people that they're around were not the same people who were with my parents' generation, but yet that legacy of distrust and sometimes hatred is still there. We want equitable resources. We want equitable resources. And we want our kids to have new books and we want our teachers to be trained. But our parents couldn't communicate that because what they wanted, and I say our parents, my parents' parents, what they wanted was their child to have the best. And they thought at the white institution, they're getting the best. And so instead of pushing for the resources, they felt as if they go to the schools, then here you go. I also think, that maybe in the rural environment that I grew up, it wasn't necessarily a push for that, but they recognized that the state of the country was changing and that they weren't going to make waves and not allowing it to change because they knew it was going to be for the better of their students. And I don't think all people thought of the psychological aspect for that student. I think, now that's the first thing we think of when we think of kids. We think of how are they developing, cognitively and what's happening in their thought process. But I think at the time it was just giving kids an opportunity to have the best. And I know even with my own children, sometimes I consider sending them to school here or there, but at the heart of it, I'm still looking at the cultural component, because I recognized that as a kid growing up in a school that was mostly white, that it didn't feel comfortable. And I remember our fight song in high school was Dixie, and not feeling as if I could say anything about it, and being embarrassed by the idea that that was the fight song. And so now I put my kids in places where they can see diversity of cultures, so that they won't feel as if they are the singleton in the group. I hope to see myself actually starting my business called Patterns of Life and Preservation. The goal of the business is to actually preserve the history of African American communities and African American families, as well as just anyone looking to preserve their history. But one of my main interests is with African Americans, because I noticed that a lot of us have this code of silence, especially my parents and people who were before them, not wanting to talk about segregation and talking about the experiences that they had going into the back of industries, or not being able to try on clothes. And so I would love to get more people having conversations like you and I today, just about the general things that they remember, and giving that lasting memory to their grandkids or their children, and documenting opportunities for the families to go out and find relatives who don't have a marker, or finding resources and records. So I think we spent so much time as African Americans fighting for equitable services and fighting for rights and justice, that we forgot to preserve our past. And so with that, now as an adult with children, I'm like, I want to preserve that past for them. I want them to know all the wonderful stories that my grandmother gave me, and I want them to be proud of who they are. And I see a lot of students on campuses who are not proud of who they are, because they have no one telling them, no one giving them that added value of you are someone who came of legacy, and you are someone whose ancestors charted those waters, and even though it was forced migration, you came across that great ocean and you survived, and you have a story to tell. And I feel as if this business, Patterns of Life and Preservation, will give people an inspired hope to not only have conversations with each other, but to give their kids a curriculum at home, conversations at home about what you can do to preserve your past and what you can do to be proud of who you are. I'm not sure how that business is going to work. I just see now a greater need to communicate with churches, people who are not silent about their past, and documenting it in some way and leaving it with them. I hope that at my funeral, that people will say Courtney Webster did her best to empower not only her children and her family, but she wanted to empower the whole African American community, not just on a level of race and nationality, but of humanity. And so my goal, teaching history, teaching social studies, teaching preservation, would be that somebody walks away feeling as if, because they knew me, that they can also do the same and empower others.